Hi class, it's Bill Berry back with a Java 2 video on MVC, Model View Controller. One quick note though, please make sure that you have watched the observer design pattern videos. This one won't make nearly as much sense without having watched that one, so please take care of that and then we'll proceed. So what is MVC? It's a way to architect your code, architect projects, such that classes communicate very nicely between themselves in some specific ways that we'll talk about. It provides a nice framework for swapping out code, swapping out sort of modular pieces without a lot of fuss, without a lot of recompiles and to-dos. So it is a well-known pattern that we're going to discuss. So what is it? Well, let's look at the three words in the acronym: model, view, and controller. First is the model. The model is where the whole heart of the thing lies. It's where the core logic is, where the basic state of the whole thing is kept. The core data for the whole application is kept there. It's sort of the brains of the deal, right? It's the place where you go for all the goodies. So what is the view? Well, the view is going to be a user interface. It's often going to be a GUI, sometimes a display, sometimes those two things combined, whatever, any of those things work. But the interesting thing is, I think of the view as being a particularly stupid sort of component. It doesn't interpret things for itself. It doesn't really understand why things are going to be done based on data that's coming in through the GUI, let's say. It doesn't really understand the bigger picture of what things mean. It may understand that things have happened, and as we're going to see in some examples, it doesn't even necessarily know that. But it certainly, at maximum, manages itself as a graphical user interface and then doesn't really understand the implications of anything big. Third component is called the controller, and the controller is going to sit between the view and the model. And that is the place where that interpretation is going to happen. So when things happen in the view, the controller may say, I know what that means. And then it takes care of informing the right party about what needs to happen. Sometimes it asks the view to adjust itself, like, I see, since that happened, you need to show this new pane, or you need to take care of graying out this set of menu items, or things like that. And it may pass off information to the model saying, okay, this happened in the view. I know that that makes a difference in what's going on over in the model, so I'm going to send it on to that. We're also going to see that in some implementations, it is really the only way that data goes back and forth between the model and the view, although you're going to certainly see other ways that that's implemented where, yeah, it's not quite the case. So let's look at a couple of sample diagrams from the internet. They are attributed in case you want to go look more about them. But in this particular case, let's look at what's going on. We have the view here at left in green, and the view is going to take user actions and inform the controller. Certainly about anything of note, maybe about everything. It just depends on what's going on, how the thing is set up. But the controller gets to know anything interesting that's happening in the view so that it can decide what to do. Sometimes the controller then sends some instruction back to the view and say, oh, okay, you need to update yourself a little bit based on this. So the interpretation is happening here in the controller, right? And the controller is going to then send things back, right? So user actions come in and the controller sends information back to the view at times, and at other times, or sometimes at the same time, going to send information over to the model. So the controller says, hey, my model needs to be updated because user actions have caused something interesting to happen, and so that information then gets passed to the model. Then how does the model communicate to the view? Well, in this particular one, in this illustration, the model triggers some sort of update which lets the view know that it needs to change. And the view may then, in a pull model, query the model for the state so that it can know that information and make use of it. So notice this piece sounds really familiar, right? This piece certainly sounds like an observer. Does that make sense to you? If we drew a circle around this, this looks like a typical observer where this is the subject and this is the observer, right? Now, the other way that you can look at this, though, is if I erase all of that, Let us erase the ink on that slide. Pointer option, sorry. Okay, so another way to look at it is this almost looks like one as well, right? This looks like another one where perhaps this is the subject and this is the observer, correct? So in some models, both of those are happening. You might have a double observer design pattern implemented here. But one way or another, that's a way to understand, the basic way to understand how MVC works in this setup. Now in this one's going to be, it's not that different, but in this case, the user interacts with the view passes information to the controller reads that information. Notice this one is missing an arrow coming here. The controller passes information to the model triggers events, the view responds to those events. So this one is a little bit more circular, but you see the general way in which that's going to go, right? So what's missing here is that arrow, right? This one is not necessarily here in this particular model. Now this is another kind of nice illustration. I like this sort of looks like the head first design pattern book. And in this one, it's making the communication here always happening through this layer, right? The communication always happens through the controller. And that may be the case as well. So any way that you look at these, you get the general idea of what's going on, I hope, with the model, view, and controller. Now there's some good examples. This one's a little bit deeper, and if you want to explore it, since it's from a publisher who sells books, I'm not going to show their code, but you can certainly go and download the MP3 player example app from the Head First Design Pattern book, and you can go check that out to see one example of an MVC model in action. I'm going to show you another one that comes from a school, so we'll look at that in a minute. So again, let's look quickly at what these things are. Well, it's not a design pattern per se, it's actually a compound design pattern. It's made up of 3 other design patterns, right? So compound means more than one. So in this case, one of the big components, as we've already seen, is the observer. So we see 2 different places where that could be used. We have the model view piece, which sounds like a classic observer. In fact, that's very similar to what we implemented in our one of our projects. And then in some implementations, you might have another set of observers, and this is the subject, and the controller is an observer. So that kind of makes sense, right? Observer is at the heart of how this works. But we're also making use of a couple others. One is called the strategy pattern. We haven't talked about it, but it's one of the first ones that's introduced in some texts, and that is a way to swap out algorithms, to swap out behavior at runtime. And we've already seen how we can do that with an observer as well, right? The ways that we've used that in the past, if you use interfaces properly, you can swap these things out even at runtime. If you use an observer pattern, you can swap in different behavior. In this case, you can actually swap out the view for a different one. If you want a shinier view or a different view for a different OS or however you want to do it, you can certainly do that. And if you set it up correctly, you don't really have to do a lot of recompiling, hopefully no recompiling to make this work. It's just another view that can be swapped out at runtime. Same way with the controller. You might get a controller that's smarter, uses more heuristics or whatever. You can swap that out without upsetting the whole universe here, right? It's pretty easy to swap out these pieces, and that's what the strategy pattern does. One more that's used is the composite pattern. And we haven't talked about that one either, but the composite pattern is essentially one thing that is actually composed of a bunch of things, right? Those collection of things actually work together to do a single thing. So in this case, our GUIs are really made up of a whole bunch of components. For instance, they're made up of frames, which may have a panel on them, and that panel may have other panels and buttons and sliders and all sorts of interesting things on them. So together, all of this stuff acts as one thing, even though it's really made up. It's composed of a whole bunch of interesting things. That's the composite pattern. So a whole bunch of interesting information here about how MVC is really just a compound pattern. And once you understand that, then it doesn't seem so mysterious. It seems more straightforward. The next video we're going to pick up with another example of looking at some code for it. So we'll take that, one of the university examples that I found that I kind of like. So we'll look at that in the next slide. So thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for the next one coming soon.